hopefully you can all see the title slide there. Yeah, I can see some thumbs up. That's great. Now, for everybody, just to do a technical thing before we start, you might have noticed it depends on your Zoom settings. But generally, if you haven't changed your Zoom settings, the images of everybody else will have now condensed to 4 or 5 on the right-hand side of your screen, which again, if you haven't changed your Zoom settings, will probably be in front of the PowerPoint slide right now, which for this slide doesn't matter too much, but actually in future slides might just get in the way a little bit. So there's a setting you can change just to get everybody out of the way before we get going. If you take your mouse and you hover around the top center edge of your screen, a View Options tab will appear. If you click on that View Options tab, one of the settings you can see there is called side-by-side setting or side-by-side mode, sometimes it's called. If you just click on that one, it'll just put everybody out of the way to the side of the PowerPoint slides for you so that you don't have to be moving people's faces to see the content as we go through. Right, okay, so Keeping Children Safe in Education 2023. I'm sure many of you have probably led training for your colleagues on this over the last few days. I know myself and my team have led a lot of training in a lot of schools and colleges across the country on this topic in the last few days and the last week or so. I think it's really interesting to reflect back. When I started teaching, safeguarding didn't even exist as a term that was used, and yet now it's rightly so on the tip of everyone's tongues. And when we look at the many, many facets of safeguarding and promoting welfare children and young people, we can see there's a huge degree of safeguarding considerations and elements within our regular practice. And so what we got is Keeping Children Safe in Education, this document that was first published by the DfE back in 2014, as a sort of an attempt to draw all of these different, in many cases quite disparate areas together in one document to set out the things that everybody needed to make sure they understood and put in place and were able to check and should know about ultimately. So we've got this document that has pretty much been updated every single year since then. We had 2 versions in 2015, we didn't have one in 2017, but other than that, we've had pretty much a version a year. And the reason for that is because the DfE are regularly updating it with emerging risks, key topics, key pieces of information, lessons learned from serious safeguarding incidents that have happened nationally. So as you'll know, a couple of years ago, we had the Ofsted review into sexual violence and sexual harassment in hundreds of schools and colleges. And then as a result of that, we got the new part 5 of Keeping Children Safe, the things that we need to do and know about when responding to incidents of child-on-child sexual violence, sexual harassment, and so on. So this is almost a working document, really, that is updated annually. And I know it seems a bit of a burden for a lot of colleagues to have to read this document every year, and particularly for you as DSLs, which I'm sure the majority of you are, to have to read the whole lot as well when there's over 150 pages this year. Seems a lot, but hopefully as we go through tonight, I'll kind of emphasize the importance of why we need to do that and not just tick a box to say, yeah, we quickly flick through it and so on. So I want to talk about your safeguarding requirements that come from this document before we look at some of the key changes within it. And when we think about the key safeguarding requirements, as you will know, and I'm sure you've said this to your colleagues, you need to ensure that they've all read Part 1 and Annex B. So Part 1, the information that all staff need to know, and Annex B, those key topic updates, and it refers in Part 1 to the fact they need to know Annex B as well. Now that's just colleagues who've got access to children and encounter children. There's also Annex A that I'm sure you're aware of, that colleagues who don't come into contact with children can read if the DSL directs them to. Now, I worked in 5 schools myself as a teacher and senior leader, and we work with just over 800 now. I'm still very, very rarely come across a member of staff who never comes across a child when it comes to schools, but apparently they do exist. So you might have some colleagues who read Annex A, but pretty much most colleagues, if not all of them, are going to be directed to read Part 1 and Annex B. So not only do they need to read it, you need to make sure they've understood it. And whether you do knowledge tests or whatever else you do to be able to demonstrate that is down to you to ensure that that is the case, rather than just people ticking a box and signing something. The second thing just to point out, because we've come across this as a bit of an issue still in the work that we do, you need to ensure that the wider senior team and governors have also read Part 2 and Annex C as a minimum, and other parts as necessary. So as you'll all know, Part 2 is the management of safeguarding. So the DSLs and deputy DSLs need to read that. But because it talks very much, and has done for the last few years now, about how safeguarding incidents affect attendance, attainment, behaviour, well-being, the reality is that your whole senior team need to know about the safeguarding requirements, because safeguarding incidents in children are affecting their work. And equally, your whole governing board needs to have read Part 2, because in Part 2, it talks about not only what should be in place, but also that governors and trustees and proprietors have strategic leadership responsibility. It's quite a loaded phrase, that, this year and last year, for what is a voluntary position. And I'm speaking as a governor in two different settings myself here. Governors need to know what they're supposed to be doing. And linked to that then, Annex C at the back. Now, Annex C, as I'm sure you're aware, is the job description for a DSL. And so your governors need to read that, because if they have strategic leadership responsibility, how can they provide effective scrutiny and challenge and support unless they know as a minimum what the DSL is supposed to be doing? So they need to know the DSL's job description, which changes annually. We'll come to that in a few minutes. So as a minimum, everybody needs to read those. Any governors involved in recruitment should read Part 3. Any involved in allegations should read Part 4. And of course, everybody's supposed to understand the context and remit of Part 5, child on child abuse. So it's at your discretion who reads the additional bits, but I would recommend as a minimum that is met. Part 3 then of these recommendations and requirements is that you make sure your safeguarding and child protection policy is updated in line with Keeping Children Safe 23. And that's something for you to check. Now, you can write your own policies from scratch. You can use local authority model policies. You can download national model policies through organisations like the Key. There's loads of others like that as well. Not advertising any of them there, but I know we come across quite a lot regularly. Whichever you decide to do, you have a responsibility to make sure that is in line with Keeping Children Safe 23. As part of the work we do, we provide a service for schools, or one of the things we do for schools and colleges is that sort of friendly pair of eyes review that's very much designed to support schools. So we come in and we look at all policies and procedures and the website before we look at the schools. And then we also then spend a day on site looking at literally anything connected to safeguarding or mental health, depends on the review, and then provide recommendations, reports and support to the schools as to how to improve that. Now, within that, as you'd expect, we review safeguarding policies and procedures. And a lot of the schools we work with nationally across the country have adopted their local authority model policies. And to date this year, we've already reviewed 7 schools, I think 8 schools, sorry, now as of today, who've used local authority policies, and we've spotted issues with every single one of them. So just because it's the local authority policy doesn't mean necessarily that it's watertight. Equally, if you use the national model policies, they haven't got the local arrangements in them. So they might be written by lawyers and legal teams, but at the same time, you've got to make sure it's talking about your local safeguarding arrangements. So whichever way you look at it, there is a job to do for you just to make sure, and your governors ultimately to make sure, that your policy is bespoke for your setting, but also matches the requirements of Keeping Children Safe. And linked to that, the other thing we've got to make sure is updated is your staff behaviour policy or code of conduct in line with Keeping Children Safe. And if you look within Keeping Children Safe this year, it talks about the fact that your staff code of conduct or behaviour policy should include whistleblowing, low-level concerns, and so on. And the reason for that is often we regularly find that we speak to schools, speak to members of staff, and you sort of say, what do you do if you've got a concern about a colleague? And some of them will say, oh, it's the allegations policy, or no, that's the child protection policy, or no, that's the staff code of conduct, or hang on a minute, that's whistleblowing, or is it low-level concerns? And before you know it, you've got 5 or 6 policies that are all saying slightly different things because you've updated them at different points. And so the recommendation from the DFE, it's a should, not a must, in Keeping Children Safe, is that it should include whistleblowing, low-level concerns. I think from a good practice point of view, what you're doing is putting all of these things in one place so that everybody knows, if I've got a concern, that's where I go. So I think as a minimum, those are the kind of things that you want to make sure are in place in line with this document. But let's talk about some of the changes within it. So if we look at some of the key changes this year, and I am deeply conscious that some of you, I'm sure, have probably led training for your colleagues on the changes to this document this year, but we've got changes in each of the parts. So part 1, there's a requirement around staff knowledge with filtering and monitoring. Part 2, with lots more references to filtering and monitoring. There's this new phrase, children absent from education, as well as children missing. There's the reference to some children being at much greater risk. Part 3, around safe recruitment, there's some clarification around the requirements around online searches. It's a minor change, but we'll cover it in a few minutes. Part 4 has got a minor change again around lettings if you hire out your premises, and the need to contact the LADO in certain circumstances. Part 5, the child on child abuse section, has got a language change in there. There's also an emphasis on sanctions, so we'll cover that as well. It's a minor change, but it's worth making sure you've covered it. And then Annex B, the key topics at the back that everybody reads. We've got that children absent from education phrase again. We've got increased links between, or references to the links between mental health and attendance issues. We've got references to the change in forced marriage or marriage legislation that's impacted on the forced marriage requirements and resources. And then we've got some language changes around prevent and the channel process. And then Annex C, your job description at the back, we've got changes around your responsibility to lead filtering and monitoring. So there are not as many changes as have been in previous years, but these are crucial things that you just want to make sure that you're happy that you've got that covered in your setting. So we'll spend a few minutes going through each of those, and I'll signpost you to some useful resources and so on. And then we'll also just talk about where the landscape, how the landscape's shifting really, and where we're going with this, and things you might want to think about going forward. As you'll see on the left there, online safety is a theme throughout the document. Online safety is referenced 156 times, I think it is, in Keeping Children Safe. Online issues are. So no longer are online safety incidents a separate topic. It is a separate section it's referred to, but really what we see when we're dealing with safeguarding incidents is most of them have an online element these days, because the world is online, isn't it? Look at us doing this today. We wouldn't be doing this 5-6 years ago. So just bear in mind, just because it's online safety, it's still safeguarding, it's still child protection, it still comes under the DSLs. So let's just spend a bit more time just going into a bit more detail about some of those changes. The first one, part 1, it does say quite clearly that as part of their safeguarding and online safety training, staff need to understand the expectations, the roles, the responsibilities around filtering and monitoring now. It's emphasised several times throughout this document. And so as the DSL, you need to ensure that your colleagues are aware of what the filtering and monitoring systems are, how they work, their responsibilities in making sure they are effective, that they are reporting things, that they understand what happens when it goes wrong or when it isn't working, what they need to do, and so on. And so that's part of the training requirement. They need an update. I would give them an update as soon as you can, really, if you haven't done so already, to make sure that bit is covered. Because that links into part 2, which, as we've said already, the management of safeguarding. Now, a large chunk of part 2 is talking about filtering and monitoring. And all of this, of course, relates to online safety, doesn't it? When we're thinking about filtering and monitoring, it talks about the fact that governors need to make sure the DSL takes lead responsibility for it. And this is something we often flag when we're doing the friendly pair of eyes reviews, as it were, for schools to support them. Often schools and colleges have got a separate online safety lead who isn't in the safeguarding team. But if you look in your job description, it's very clear that the DSL has to take lead responsibility for online safety. And so that's been there since 2018. So as a minimum, you need to know what's going on. They're reporting into you. It might be worth training, if you've got a separate online safety lead, training them as a deputy DSL. So they're in the team. However it works, it's under your remit as a DSL. Boards, governing boards and trustees need to make sure all staff understand those expectations and roles and responsibilities, we've said already. Your policy, your child protection policy, needs to include filtering and monitoring references and how it works. And then crucially, your governing boards should review the DfE's filtering and monitoring standards, and also the cybersecurity standards, which hasn't been mentioned as much, but is in there. And they should discuss with the IT staff what needs to be done to be able to meet these standards if you're not meeting them already. So that's really important that we cover that and we talk about that. Now, if we look at filtering and monitoring, this isn't new to keeping children safe. It was in there last year as well. It's just been highlighted more, and there's increased emphasis on it. So if you look at last year in part 2, when it talked about the responsibility to provide a safe environment, that means we do all we reasonably can to limit risk from an online perspective, it did say, and it still does say, as part of this process, governing bodies and proprietors should ensure there's appropriate filtering and monitoring systems in place and regularly review their effectiveness. And so this is something that has come about because of stories like the very tragic case of Frankie Thomas from 4 or 5 years ago now, where she was viewing some very harmful material online, who tragically took her own life. And it was highlighted in that review that she was in effect using the school networks, and the school filtering and monitoring systems were not preventing her from seeing that. And it was highlighted as a key contributing factor. None of us want to be in that position. Of course we don't. So it was talked about last year. It's been enhanced this year because of the filtering and monitoring standards. And so I suppose the key question to ask you is, how many of you could evidence or document governor scrutiny of your filtering and monitoring systems? You know, if you were asked tomorrow, can you show or can you prove that your governors are checking the effectiveness of the filtering and monitoring, what would you say? Because when we're doing the friendly pair of eyes reviews, it's something that regularly flags. So actually, there's nothing much there to say. A useful thing, just a good practice hint for you, is of course, you know, the governors having a report as to the meeting the filtering and monitoring standards. But from a good practice perspective, the quick win is when your safeguarding governor comes in, get them to test the system in front of you. Get them to sit there, log on to Google or whatever search engine you're using and type in how to make a bomb or porn or whatever it is. And then A, watch it get blocked. And B, you should then get a report that someone's just tried to search for this. So you can demonstrate the effectiveness of the system in a few seconds. It's always interesting, though. We've come across a few where, in theory, we're paying a lot of money to a service provider, and yet it's not actually doing what you think it is. Hence why we've got these standards that have come in. So I'll give you an example with one school, a couple of schools actually that we were working with in the south of England, where we went and spoke to them and said, right, let's have a look at filtering and monitoring systems. And one of the things we typed in was ISIS activity and news. And if you look at images and video feeds on the news feed, sometimes news channels don't get filtered the same way. And we were able to see beheading videos on a school system. And they were thinking, they sort of said, we pay thousands of pounds for this. Why is that not working? And you think, well, that's the reason we need to check these things, because just because we pay someone to do it doesn't mean it works. And so that's why the requirement's in there, to routinely check that this is working, and for you to, as DSLs, to know that this is covered. So what we've got this year is increased clarification. It's linked to the prevent duty, which I'll come back to in a minute as well, that it talks about you need to think about your risk assessment for prevent and how that feeds into filtering and monitoring systems. And then it talks about the DfE's published filtering and monitoring standards. Now, these were published back in February and have now been referred to this year. And they cover lots of different aspects. And it's important, therefore, that you and the governing board are confident that either you are meeting these standards or there's a clear plan in place to be able to effectively meet these standards as soon as possible. And therefore, you need to know how filtering works. You know, could you all say right now, does your filtering system filter URLs? Does it filter keywords? Is it category based? The monitoring systems, are they keystroke monitoring? How's the reporting coming through to you? Is it active? Is it passive? There's so many different ways that this can work, that you as a DSL need to be up to date on that and get updates from your IT team if you're not clear as to where we are with it. So moving away from keeping children safe, although it is absolutely what we're talking about right now, if you go on to gov.uk, you will see the published filtering and monitoring standards that are there. They're under the banner, the digital technologies and technology standards in schools. So there's the filtering and monitoring standards, but also interestingly in there are also the cybersecurity standards. And this is another area we work on with schools extensively and colleges, because there's a lot of phishing attacks coming through right now. Of the 800 schools that we work with, over 4 4 have had a ransomware attacks in the last 8 days. So since the start of term, I can't even do the maths, whatever percentage that is, we've had 4 of the schools we work with that have already had the ransomware attack. So, this is happening. I don't know whether the criminals or the organised crime groups are taking advantage of the fact that schools are just flat out busy. I don't know, but worth making sure you're covering the cybersecurity stuff as well. And then just to signpost you to some useful organisations, I think if you look at the UK Safer Internet Centre, they've produced some really useful resources for you in terms of a guide around filtering and monitoring providers. You can go on there. There's sort of an overview of what needs to be looked at, a kind of checklist for you that's really useful. It's all free to access. They're a great organisation. So I would recommend you go and have a look at that. There's also on their website as well, you can see the responses from all of the main filtering providers out there that they've asked in terms of how they meet the requirements that are out there as well. So you can go on there and you can see if your provider's on there and do they meet the requirements, and if not, and they don't all meet them exactly, and that's really important you're aware of that. And you can find others on there, and it's impartial. I don't think they get any money from any of them, but it's a really useful impartial overview. So go and have a look at that. They've also got the monitoring providers on there as well. So again, worth just having a look at it. It's a free resource for all of you that's really useful information, particularly in terms of meeting this safeguarding requirement. And just finally, I feel like I should get commission for the UK Safer Internet Centre. I don't. It's just a really useful free resource for you all that we recommend all the time. They've also got a filtering and monitoring checklist for you. So you can kind of use that and go through, this is what we checked, this is who's in charge, this is what's being done, and so on. And then, not the UK Safer Internet Centre, but sort of connected to them in a way, you've got South West Grid for Learning. They've also got a really useful set of guidance for you and around things like managing bring your own devices policies and so on. So I know this is a relatively, what seems like potentially a large body of work, but there is a lot of support out there from organisations like these two and others as well. London Grid for Learning, there's a few others out there that are doing a lot to support schools free of charge as well. So yeah, filtering and monitoring, one of the first tasks to make sure you've got covered really from this year's Keeping Children Safe. It's probably the biggest change that's in there. Let's go back to Keeping Children Safe though and just look at some of the other documents. Well, still with part 2 for a moment, we've got a couple of things in there. The first one is clarification about some children being at greater risk of harm than others, both online and offline. That's in paragraph 170. There's other paragraphs referring to that as well. And I think it is really important that it's visible and understood in your setting that we know that some children are at greater risk of harm than others, because they are statistically. You look at the national data, with children with SEND, we see 3 times the rate of abuse and neglect. We do. So not only, therefore, do we need to acknowledge we've got a greater risk there, but we need to train and support in a different way as well. So a question that often gets asked is, we know that children with SEND experience 3 times the rate of abuse and neglect, but why is that? Because unless we know why it is, what are we going to be able to do to protect and prevent above and beyond what we do for everybody else? So if you're not sure, it's paragraph 199 of Keeping Children Safe. It clearly sets out this is why. On that note, from a good practice point of view, when we're doing the friendly pair of eyes reviews for schools, we review all of the policies and the website and everything with a fine tooth comb. You'd be surprised how many SEND policies me and the team read that don't even mention the word safeguarding, let alone acknowledge this increased risk. And yet it's crucial. Yes, your safeguarding child protection policy should mention safeguarding, but surely in your SEND policy, we should be acknowledging there's an increased risk here. We've got increased vulnerability. So worth just checking, just as an aside there, that bit's covered. And then we've got this terminology around children absent from education and clarification of how that's different to children missing education. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes because that's also in Annex B. So we'll come back to that point, but it's important that you're clear and your colleagues are clear about the difference. And then in part 3, we've got the recommendation, because it's a should, not a must. So you should be doing it unless you've got a very good reason not to. And I can't think of many good reasons not to, but you should be informing shortlisted candidates that you might be conducting an online search as part of those due diligence tests. and checks that you do in that recruitment process. So the online searches, that's just a clarification from last year, really. The online searches went in last year as a recommendation, again, that we should be carrying out online searches. Now, I know these feel like a bit of a minefield, really, because what are we searching for? Where do we stop? How much detail do we go into? What exactly are we looking at? Who's doing it? How does it not cloud the shortlisting process? It seems quite a complex area. And yet, the reason it's gone in, because this was talked about with the Safer Recruitment Consortium and others a number of years ago, and it didn't go into keeping children safe, and then it went in this year. And the reason it's gone in this year is because of a serious incident that happened in Oxfordshire a few years ago, where a teaching assistant was appointed to a school who had come over to live in the UK from Spain, and for whatever reason, the overseas police check from the Spanish police came back clear, and yet she'd actually been convicted of murdering a child in Spain. And she was appointed to the school in Oxfordshire, and had the school Googled her, it was all over the media. It just, for some reason, what didn't make it in the Spanish police check that came back. So the overseas check came back as clear, and yet you can imagine, rightly so, the furore as a result of finding out what actually had happened. And so as a result of that, and a couple of other cases that are sort of similar to that as well, it was decided we're going to put this in. And so if we are going to do online searches, there's certain things that we need to be clear on. What are we searching? What detail are we going into? What depth, and so on? Now, this went in last year, so I'm hoping most of you kind of got this bit covered. But what we've got this year is the clarification that we need to be making sure we're informing candidates that we're doing this. They have a right to know that we're going to do online searches. So the recommendation is that we do this post shortlisting so that it doesn't cloud the judgment process. And then we make sure that we are searching in a consistent way. So therefore, you need to be clear about what you're searching, who's doing it, and what does that then lead to? You know, otherwise, before you know it, you spent 4 hours looking at someone's holiday photo and it wasn't actually the applicant for the job that you thought it was in the first place. So, you know, we've got to make sure that we're clear about what we're doing. So just in terms of just advice, and it's up to you to decide what you want to do, but most of the schools we work with generally go along the lines of, when we shortlist, we ask candidates for their social media handles and what they are, if they use social media, and then we will do a search of each of those social media accounts if they use them, plus then Google the candidate's name and their current address, candidate's name and any previous addresses, candidate's name and current school or college, and candidate's name and any previous schools and colleges, and then maybe stop there. It's up to you, but you need a kind of consistent approach. And whatever that looks like, then you need guidance about that in your safer recruitment policy. So that's absolutely crucial, that your safer recruitment policy has been updated, because it does say in Keeping Children Safe that your safer recruitment policy is updated in accordance with Part 3, and Part 3's changed this year. So the safer recruitment policy should be updated annually in line with Keeping Children Safe. We regularly review schools and colleges where it's done on a sort of triennial or biennial review, which means for a year or two, it's going to be partially non-compliant. So worth checking. As I've said already, this year, you need to make sure there's wording going out to candidates that you're going to be doing this. So whether that's in your privacy notices or the shortlisting invitation for interview, whatever it may be, candidates need to know, they've got a right to know that you are going to do this and what you are going to do. So yeah, that's the change this year, really. From a good practice point of view, I'd also make sure that you've included a step in your recruitment procedures so that whoever does the checks for you knows what they're going to check and when, and who they're feeding that through to before the interview stage, so that you can ask those questions that might come out of that. And that's not just necessarily to find issues with the candidates. It might be to protect the candidates, because that, you know, they've got their social media settings on, or privacy settings, really low, and therefore, as you all know, when new members of staff get appointed, one of the first thing all children and parents do is Google the new member of staff, don't they? And try and find out their first name, because that's power to children and all the rest of it. So it's important that we're able to ask questions about that at that interview stage. I'd also then include a tick box in the front of your personnel file so that you can show that you've done the online searches at the right point in time. And so that's important that that's there. You can evidence you've done them. And then also, this is just a good practice recommendation, but I would recommend attending the updated Safer Recruitment Consortium type training. We work with the Safer Recruitment Consortium, so I do need to disclose that we deliver their kind of training for them, but they kind of set the national standard around safer recruitment training. It's a full day, and there's lots of since it was and they enabled lots of other providers to do it a few years ago. There's lots of courses out there, including some quite short online, watch a video, tick a box, those kind of courses. I think this area is too important to not train properly in. It's hard, for my team and other members of the Safer Recruitment Consortium who do that kind of training. It's hard to do it in a full day, let alone in a couple of hours. So the reason I recommend redoing that, as I'm sure you're aware, is the requirement to update safer recruitment training is a 5-year window. So you only have to do it every 5 years. But if you haven't refreshed it in the last couple of years, there's been so many changes that it's almost a different system. So obviously we got Brexit, which means the overseas checks work differently now. We had the DFE, or the governmental responses to various test cases that were published in November 2020 around the things that don't now show up on DBSs, like youth cautions, multiple convictions, and various other things. That changed again a couple of months ago. We've got the requirement to get self-disclosure forms now. We've had DBS changes. We've had the online searches stuff. And so if we're not careful, we did the training 4 or 5 years ago, but it's pretty out of date, even if it's 2 or 3 years ago. So it's just up to you. I would recommend refreshing it if you haven't done it in the last couple of years, just so that you're aware of the current systems and processes. Okay, let's just stick with some of the changes in a little bit more detail again. Part 3 has got a little more emphasis on how, as schools and colleges, we need to create the right culture so that people feel comfortable discussing safeguarding matters in and outside of work. Including online, do we feel comfortable talking about things that we're seeing online, things that people are saying to us, things that we observe our colleagues doing as well? This kind of feeds into this low-level concern narrative. What we're supposed to do when we've got low-level concerns about colleagues, which is in part 4, as you know. Again, just as an aside, when we do the friendly pairs of eyes reviews for schools, as you'd expect, we speak to lots of members of staff. I would say in the last 2 years, since low-level concerns came into keeping children safe, well over 50%, maybe nearly 2/3 of the staff we've spoken to don't know what a low-level concern is. And that's a concern, because if you don't know what it is, how are you going to report it? And schools and colleges, rightly so, are being asked for their records of low-level concerns now and their analysis of what they've done. So, how do we get better at creating this culture where people are able to report and self-report as well, is a key question I suppose we all need to reflect on. Right, let's just talk about part 4 then. Now, part 4, as you know, is about managing allegations. So we've kind of just been talking about that a little bit in terms of low-level concerns. But there's also just tweaking of the wording around what do we do if we get an allegation that someone who is working for an organisation or an individual who's using your school premises to run an activity, what do we do if we get an allegation or an incident relating to them? And so they've put in this year, we have to make sure that we are referring that to the LADO as well. Even then, if they're not one of our members of staff, one of our volunteers, whatever it may be, an agency member of staff, if they are using your premises, then you get a concern that gets reported to the LADO. And I want to just go spend a little bit more time talking about keeping children safe and lettings, excuse me, and talk about what went in last year that's still there, that's feeding into. So if you look at paragraphs 166 and 167, it talks about the fact that governors and proprietors need to ensure that appropriate arrangements are in place. That includes, if you're hiring out your premises, that whoever you are hiring it to has got appropriate safeguarding and child protection policies and procedures in place, including inspecting these as necessary. Now, that's really crucial that you check this. It used to be the case a few years ago that if you hired out your sports hall on a Wednesday night to a karate club or whatever it is, that as long as they let you know that they were going to stick to your safeguarding policy, you were kind of covered. Well, now that's not acceptable as of last year even. What we know is if an organisation is using your school hall or premises, what we know is that members of the public are using the fact it's at school to vet whether or not it's safe. And therefore, you are responsible. It's your premises to make sure it is. So you have to make sure you've checked that karate club leader, to use that example, has got a child protection safeguarding policy. They've had training. There's a DSL there. You know what they're going to do. They know what they're going to do, and you can inspect that. So that's the first thing. And this year, remember, if we get an allegation about them, we need to make sure we're phoning the ladder about it. They also need to have arrangements in place to liaise with you where appropriate, if any of your children are involved. But then crucially, it's worth checking. It says that safeguarding requirements are included in any lease or hire agreements as a condition of use, and that failure to comply with that will lead to termination of the agreement. So that's really important that you're checking that. Now, it might not be you, it might be a business manager, I don't know. But if you are renting out your premises, it's clearly in the statutory document that you have to have in the hire agreement this conditional use around they have safeguarding procedures in place, training, policies, and so on. And if they don't stick to that, the hire agreement's terminated. So you'd be surprised again how many schools and colleges we work with and review where they don't have a lettings policy, let alone one or even a lettings document that refers to any of this kind of content. And that's really making you quite exposed and vulnerable. So I'd make sure that's tied down as soon as you can, really. And then let's just move a little bit further back in the document, part 5. Well, we know there's been slight changes there in terms of the terminology. So part 5, child-on-child sexual violence, sexual harassment. What we've got this year is just a language change really around sanctioning and just reference to the fact that we can and possibly should be sanctioning those where we get breaches of the behaviour policies in this area. Because if you have got a situation of child-on-child abuse, remember that therefore, even if you've got 2 victims where one victim has harmed another, you might have a breach of your behaviour policies that mean you need to possibly sanction. So they've just reminded everybody of that. It's a tiny tweak, but one just to be aware of. And then Annex B. So remember, this is the bit that all of your colleagues are going to have read and hopefully understood as well. We've got a couple of changes in there, a few changes. The first one is around that phrase I've already mentioned, children absent from education. Now, historically, as you'll all be very aware, we've got a concern around children missing education. But what we've got now is this additional sort of category of children absent, and the guidance, it very much implies that children absent is the level before children missing. And so it's important that you're aware of the difference, your colleagues are aware of the difference, because this is in Annex B that they've all read. And linked to that, we've got an increased reference to the fact that attendance might be connected to mental health concerns as well. So what we're seeing is growing acknowledgement from the DfE that we've got some quite complex stuff going on here where we might have additional vulnerabilities and possibly safeguarding concerns that we need to respond to when a child is just absent, not when they're missing. And so what do we do before they get to missing and not being on site? What do we do when they're persistently absent? And again, I'm just going to veer off from keeping children safe and look at some other documents for a minute, but you'll see where this is coming from. If we look at the DfE's attendance data, this update was published in the summer, about 4 weeks ago, and it was obviously the update to give us the whole attendance figures for the last academic year. If we look at the attendance rate, we can see overall absence was 7.5%, authorised 5%, unauthorised 2.5%. But it's that persistent absentee figure that you can see that it's the concern that's feeding into keeping children safe, 22.3%. Huge figure. And actually, if you look at the bottom right there, you can see that's significantly shifted in the last 2 years since the lockdowns. So what we've seen is not far off a doubling of persistent absenteeism. And actually, you can see that on the left-hand side there, 117% increase. That's now 1.6 million children who are persistently absent. And therefore, what we are seeing when you look at the research is there's a lot going on here. It is not just children not wanting to come to school. And the DfE are acknowledging the landscape has shifted. You can see it in keeping children safe. You can see it in the attendance guidance documents as well. If we look at research from the Centre for Social Justice that was published earlier on in March, their research showed, well, we've got 125,000 persistently absentee pupils at that point. And if you look at the data down at the bottom there, you can see also we've got a sizable percentage who were never in class, who are severely absent, 50% or more, and so on. If you look at those severely absent young people, 125,000 of them, as you can see at the top there, They're in that sort of red column at the bottom, or the red section at the bottom of each column. Different years, different level of impacts, and so on. That's 125,000 children who are missing 50% or more. We've got 140,000 children who are just never there as well. So what we're seeing with these young people is there's something going on here that might not just be they don't want to be here. And therefore, as DSLs and from a safeguarding point of view, we need to be in the loop in that consideration, conversation, and discussion and action plan around what we do, which is why this is feeding into keeping children safe. If you look at other pieces of research that happened this year, we had the Children's Commissioner's report in February, then we had the Children's Society's report back in June, and then Foundation's report at the end of July, just gone a few weeks ago. If we look within those reports, we can see there's a lot of understanding now and acknowledgement that when we've got children at risk of persistent absenteeism, this is way more than just truancy. And actually, when you look at the data, it's about 10% of children are truanting in that sense, not wanting to be there. The other 90%, something else is going on, which is why this is feeding into keeping children safe. So if we look at some of the categories, what we're seeing is children with SEND, far higher rates of persistent absenteeism. It was always the case, but that's become even more pronounced. Anxiety and mental health concerns, that's even in keeping children safe as a mentioned concern now. Poverty, we are seeing a much higher rate of absence for pupils eligible for free school meals. We're seeing children not wanting to know their friends to know they're struggling. We're seeing, therefore, they're choosing not to come in rather than this being exposed. We're seeing parents not affording clean uniforms, children feel embarrassed about it, not want to get excluded or suspended for getting the incorrect uniform on, so missing them. And as a result of that, we're seeing greater risk of exploitation because we've got children not in school. So there's a safeguarding concern here too. Young carers, it's not being talked about enough, as their research showed. 40% of young carers say they never or don't often get much help from their school or college. And so what we've got is a very vulnerable group who are therefore taking time off for valid reasons, potentially. Children with social workers, twice the rate of absence. Again, very vulnerable children there, not there. And then we've also, of course, got the impact of increased numbers of parents working from home, getting out of the habit of making sure they're always in school on time and so on. So it's not just additional vulnerabilities, but a lot of it is. And so from your point of view, you need to be involved in the dialogue, because we got this document last year that I'm sure you've all been aware of, you've all worked towards supporting and putting in place and so on, working together to improve school attendance. Now that came out last May, into force last September, but it was actually updated a few days ago. I don't know if you noticed. And the update this year is a toolkit for schools around how to support and communicate with families around this area. Now, within that, and I'm just picking out the safeguarding bits here for you, it talks about the whole school culture and recognizing that children who go missing is a vital warning sign for safeguarding issues, neglect, abuse, exploitation, and so on. It also says within that there should be regular analysis of attendance data. Well, I'm sure you're all doing that, but it says within that you as DSLs, SENCOs, pupil premium leads need to be seeing that analysis. You need to be involved in that discussion, because often there might be a safeguarding consideration or vulnerability that we need to put a plan in place to manage that absence, not that child going missing. Children with a social worker, of course, we need to be reporting if there's an unexplained absence. That's in the guidance too. And then really interestingly, severe absence, as we've been talking about, over 50%, talks about if that's for unauthorized reasons, that is likely to constitute neglect. And therefore, we should be referring that through to the local authorities, and they should be treating our concern seriously, because that might well be a child protection concern and therefore a valid reason for referral. Now, we've got 152 local authorities. They've all got a different approach, but a lot of them historically have thought, well, attendance isn't a safeguarding concern, but actually it is now, and you have to remind them of that. And I'll show you why. What we've also got is these documents that are fed into keeping children safe, which is why keeping children safe, as I just mentioned to you, talks about recognizing the links with mental health and attendance issues. And this document came out, well, both of them came out in February. The summary of your responsibilities when mental health issues are affecting attendance, and then effective practice examples to support pupils where mental health is affecting attendance. So obviously mental health, we've got the senior mental health lead that might be involved here, your SENCO, you as a DSL, we know mental health concerns are one of the largest safeguarding categories of things that get reported now as well. So a lot of people need to be in the loop here, as well as whoever's managing attendance. But it does say very clearly in that guidance document, local authorities have an obligation to take into account working together to improve school attendance in what they're doing and consider their guidance. So, you know, you are entitled to refer this concern through and say, actually, I think this is neglect here, potentially at play. So that's where that feeds in. Still just touching on the changes. Annex B, remember key topics for staff. We've got a little bit of extra information about forced marriage. And what we've had really, the reason that's gone in is in February, we got legal changes, which means, as I'm sure you're aware, it's now illegal to get married under the age of 18. And therefore, that's of course fed into the forced marriage guidance and legislation. So that's been updated. That's why it's in there. You might have noticed that gov.uk, they've updated all the forced marriage resources for you for schools and colleges. So go and look on there. There's loads of free new resources for you that they updated in February as well. And then we've also got the section on preventing radicalisation and channel, which has got a language change around children who are susceptible rather than vulnerable now. They want us to use this phrase susceptible. And that's come about, the focus on prevent and the clarity around the fact that people need to consent to be involved in the channel programme. That's come about because of the new guidance, which came out the other day, which therefore was kind of preempted by this Keeping Children Safe change. So just on that note, and I know we've not got long left, but I just want to just briefly highlight to you one of the concerns that a lot of the schools and colleges we work with regularly continually flag to us, and kind of one of the functions we provide as an organisation. There are so many documents coming your way now as school leaders and college leaders that have got statutory elements, safeguarding concerns, and we all know that safeguarding is one of the first things that gets looked at. If I just look at the last 18 months for you, just briefly, what you can see, the guidance for safer working practices updated in February 22 has an impact and implications for our staff codes of conduct. We got the searching, screening, and confiscation guidance last July, has an impact on your behaviour policies and what has to be in there. The behaviour in schools documents from last September, again, has a lot of implications as safeguarding considerations in there. Working together to improve school attendance, we've just mentioned it. The responsibilities around mental health and attendance, we've just mentioned it. We then got the filtering and monitoring standards in March. We just talked about those. We've got the suspension and permanent exclusion guidance that was updated again in May. Again, we've got safeguarding considerations in there that we need to think about. We got the governmental response to the final report for the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse that came out back in May. That's feeding into where we're going, training requirements and so on. Then we've got the new inspection handbooks that came out in July. Ofsted, ISI, both of them updated around requirements that you need to know about that have changed in practice slightly. Of course, I'm sure you're aware of those. You've probably had a read through those as well. And I know one of the webinars later on is around the ISI inspection guidance, isn't it, in a few months' time as well, that we're putting on for you as well. But then, of course, Keeping Children Safe in Education. We've just been talking about today, another document. Now, you might be thinking, well, because that came into force on the 1st of September, that's the latest one, but it isn't. On the 4th of September, we had the new statutory EYFS guidance coming into force. So if you've got early years on site, you need to make sure that's referred to. It needs to be in your safeguarding policy as well. And if you updated that over the summer, you've already got to update your safeguarding policy, and we're only a week in. You might have noticed, or you might not, last week, we got the new prevent guidance duty published, duty guidance. Now, that was published on the 7th, not even a week ago. That doesn't come into force until the 31st. But again, we've got things, and that's why we saw the prevent wording changes in Keeping Children Safe. The DfE preempted this document. And then, as I'm sure you're aware, the current version of Working Together to Safeguard Children is the 2018 version. But what we're seeing is, I'm sure you're aware, there was a consultation over the summer that closed last week. And so what that means is we are, if the DfE generally are true to form, then we'll probably see a new version of Working Together to Safeguard Children that comes out around about Christmas, turn of the year maybe. And so that will have implications, because that's going to change how all agencies work together. Schools may become the fourth safeguarding partner, we don't know. If that is the case, you're going to need to update your policies and procedures mid-year. So one of the things that a lot of heads and schools that we work with say, and I know some of you say it as well, because some of you I can see from the attendee list were doing this exact thing with me this morning. We need compliance updates, really. It's great to do kind of briefings like this, but actually there's so many documents that can potentially trip you up that actually one of the kind of things we do with schools is do regular compliance updates to say, look, these are the things you need to make sure you're checking you've got in place that link to safeguarding from each of these areas. So a bit of shameless self-promotion, I suppose, at this point, really now. Do you keep up to date regarding compliance? Do you attend updates in that area? Similar to this, I know we're talking about keeping children safe, but there's so many of the documents that are out there. I know we do them regularly for schools and trusts and organisations as well. As I said, some of you did it with me this morning, so apologies, you're probably sick of the sight of me today now as well. But there's available ones online that you can do if you want to access those. You can find them on our website, but I won't do too much plugging. It's important that you just get those updates wherever you can, really. Just a final thing then on keeping children safe, just at the back there, we've got Annex C. Now, Annex C is, as I'm sure you're aware, your job description. Now, I mentioned it earlier on, I want to mention it again. The change this year is you have a responsibility to take the lead on the filtering and monitoring processes. So you need to know how they work. You're probably going to need to update your colleagues or make sure it's happened. You're going to need to be involved in the reports to governors, trustees, and so on. So that's a crucial change. A final aside for you, really, I would really recommend that as DSLs and deputy DSLs, you update your job description in your staff file to match the latest version of Annex C. Because when we review schools and colleges, at Friendly Pair of Eyes, of course, we look at staff files. You would be surprised how many staff files for DSLs we look at that don't even have a job description in them, let alone the latest one. There's no easier way to show compliance than your job description matches the latest published one from the DFE. So I would routinely update your job description each year because it does change every single year. And it's important, therefore, that you're reflecting that change. Okay, everyone, bit of a whistle-stop, fast-paced tour there of everything in keeping children safe in education and the changes for this year. I know you've done the update. It's been really great to speak to you all. If we can help in any way, please get in touch. You can contact us either through the QR code or through www.brightcoreconsultancy.com. We'll help in any way we can. As an aside, again, a final aside for you, just make sure that you're doing regular updates because, as I said already, working together is going to change before the end of this academic year. So again, it's one of these things now, we just need to continually make sure, where am I getting the safeguarding information from that will help. So thank you, everyone. We're at the end of the presentation there. It's been really a real privilege to be able to talk to you. If anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat feature. I can see we've got just the only comment in there is the one from David saying, if anyone's got any questions, put them in the chat feature. So I'm more than happy to take any questions. I'm more than happy for people to hang around as well. But if there aren't any others coming through, then I will hand back to David.